We thought we were on track for a trade deal with China, but then President Trump rocked the world and markets with his tweet threatening new tariffs. Former China trade negotiator Wendy Cutler says that the stakes are very high.
The pressure is enormous on both sides now, and they're both facing a serious escalation of tariffs and other measures that are not only going to affect China and the United States, but are going to affect the markets, global growth, the Asia-Pacific region, U.S. consumers, U.S. workers, U.S. businesses.
We welcome now Congressman Dan Kildee of Michigan, who serves as the Democratic Chief Deputy Whip and also sits on the House Ways and Means Committee. He joins us today from Capitol Hill. So, Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. You heard what Wendy Cutler had to say. Give us an insight into the Democratic caucus, particularly on the House side. What is the position? What is the progressive position, as it were, on trade at this point with respect to China?
Well, I think she has it exactly right. This is a really big moment. I was one who believed that the president was right to take on China. I wish he would have done it by engaging our allies rather than putting them essentially on the other side of the table. But, that's sort of, water under the bridge. But in this case, the biggest concern that we have is that we not accept a deal that is largely a transactional resolution. And I think that's what China really wants. And some of us had fear that that's what the president would accept. So I take it as a bit of a positive sign that Mr. Lighthizer and the president both seem to be willing to hold firm that we will require these structural changes regarding state ownership, intellectual property, the other structural problems that we see in the way China operates and the way it affects the global economy, and particularly the U.S. That's what we need to focus on. And I was one sounding the alarm bells that I thought the president would be willing to accept a transactional resolution to this. So I have to give him credit where credit's due. I don't always agree with him, but I'm glad that they are not willing to accept something that would be based on the increased soybean exports rather than something more fundamental.
So that sounds a bit like no deal's better than a bad deal. And it echoes, frankly, what Senator Schumer, the minority leader in the Senate, actually had to say. He tweeted right away, really be tough with the Chinese. How does that resonate back in your home state of Michigan? What are your voters? Are your voters focused on this, and what do they tell you about it?
Yeah, they're focused on it only in the sense that there is still some uncertainty in the economy. We've obviously had 100 months of sustained economic growth. That's a good thing. But there's still this uncertainty, and I think this just adds to the uncertainty. And in my district, that plays out in a couple of ways. One, manufacturers are being hurt. Obviously, when China dumps cheap steel into our economy, it undermines our own manufacturing base. The problem is, I've got a lot of farmers, I've got a lot of growers, and they are really getting hit with the retaliatory tariffs that are being placed as a result of what the president's doing to deal with China. So they want to compete, and they want to do it fairly. They'd rather not be paid reparation, essentially, for not being able to compete. They'd rather compete. So this is a complicated subject, because I agree with Senator Schumer and others. No deal is better than a sort of bad deal, which I would characterize as a transactional resolution to this. But I'm also concerned that we not get into a protracted trade war where tariffs are the only tool that we have available. We have to keep talking. And I would encourage the president to engage our allies, to engage Europe, to engage Canada, to engage the others, and try to take this on a multilateral fashion. So
let's turn to another area of uncertainty where, in a sense, the president did engage our allies, and that is the USMCA, that successor agreement to NAFTA, that it took a while to negotiate. He has what he says is a better version of NAFTA now that's pending, and yet we're told that the real hang-up is on the Democratic side over in the House. You're, as I say, the chief deputy whip. You count votes. That's what you do in that job. What are the chances of getting that through? Politico says it's down to 45%.
Yeah, I wouldn't put a percentage on it, but I will say this. There's two questions. What are the odds, and how do the odds increase if we place, I think, much more clear sort of pressure on Mexico to actually deliver on the reforms that they have begun to approve? So the question for us is, when do we say that we believe Mexico will be making the fundamental changes in their labor environment and their labor practices in order for us to not believe that we're just going to see the same thing that we saw in the original NAFTA, where there were many promises made that Mexico was going to come then into the 20th century when it comes to organized labor and the willingness that they would have to have real trade unions. Just passing the law won't be enough for many of us. We're going to have to see them take decisive action.
That sounds
we know, in fact, again, this is one of those cases where I think the president was right to renegotiate NAFTA. But the real question is, do we take Mexico at its word, or do we actually require them to implement some of these reforms? I tend toward believing that we want to see real implementation and not fall victim to the notion that there are so many grains of sand in the hourglass and that this is all going to run out. We have time to let them implement before we have to take up any approval.
So we have these major trade issues as well as others pending in the Congress. At the same time, we're spending a lot of time in the media and frankly, I think on Capitol Hill talking about Bob Mueller and his report and Attorney General Barr and whether he should come up and testify. And you know all the issues. I think you've referred to as political theater, but what's the sense within the Democratic caucus? Is there a sense within the Democratic caucus that in fact, for example, the voters back in Michigan care a lot more about things like trade that we've been talking about, bread and butter things, than they care about whether Mr. Barr comes up and testifies or doesn't?
The people I represent clearly care far more about the kitchen table economic questions that they want us to work on. And so I think the pressure that we have to feel is that while on one hand, we have to do our jobs, we can't just ignore our defense of our constitutional prerogatives, but we have to make sure that that doesn't crowd out our ability to actually work on those issues, on health care affordability, on access to college, on growing an economy that we think is more inclusive. We better be working on that, on retirement security, for goodness sake. That's a big issue for us. That really has to be front and center, and we have to believe that we can do that and also defend the constitutional prerogatives that we think are so important when it comes to the balance of powers and the separation of powers under our system of government.
When control of the House went back over to the Democratic side last fall, there was at least some hope there would be a couple of issues, maybe some around health care, certainly infrastructure, where perhaps there could be some bipartisan support that could get some things done. Is that still realistic? What is the most likely thing for this Congress actually to accomplish together?
Well, I think we could do something on drug prices, because this is, again, one of those cases where the president and Democrats in the House both have been essentially saying the same thing. We might be able to find some common ground. But, infrastructure is the big one. When the president met with congressional Democratic leaders just a couple of weeks ago and agreed that he would essentially commit to try to find a path forward on a $2 trillion infrastructure investment, I saw that as a positive sign. The devil's in the details. And, interestingly enough, this is not unrelated to the first subject that we addressed. When we think about how we compete with China, part of it is determined by the trade relationship, but part of it is looking at what China has been doing. They spend 10 times as a percentage of their GDP on infrastructure. That has been their competitive advantage. Their Belt and Road Initiative is more significant than the transactional nature of trade when it comes to their ability to compete. We need to get in the game, and I think the president understands that, and that's hopefully why he agreed to a much larger package than many of us thought he might, but now we have to work out the detail.